Welcome to On My Way to Wealth, the podcast where busy Gen Xers can learn financial tips as they navigate life on their way to wealth. And now, please join your host, Luis Rosa.
This episode is brought to you by Latin Excellence. Visit latinexcellence.com. That's Latinx, CELLENCE.com or latinxmovement.com to learn more and shop our merchandise. You are excellence. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of On My Way to Wealth, Hispanic Heritage Month Edition. My name is Luis Rosa, and I'm your host. Hispanic Heritage Month takes place from September 15th to October 15th every year as a time to recognize and celebrate the many contributions, culture, and extensive histories of the American Latino community. It first began as Hispanic Heritage Week in 1968, and later on became Hispanic Heritage Month in 1988. Since then, the month has been celebrated nationwide through festivals, art shows, conferences, community gatherings, and much more. The reason it starts on September 15th is because it celebrates the independence days of several Latin American countries, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua on September 15th, Mexico on September 16th, and Chile on September 18th. It also includes holidays that recognize Hispanic contributions, such as Virgin Islands Puerto Rico Friendship Day, which is celebrated in the U.S. Virgin Islands the second Monday in October. For this month, I'd like to highlight individuals who have made a great contribution in their chosen profession and the community at large. So now I'd like to introduce you to our very special guest today, Camilo Moreno-Salamanca. Camilo is a proud alumni of the Forster School of Business, class of 2012. Upon graduating the Forster School of Business, Camilo joined Boeing in their Business Career Foundation program, which gave him a view of Boeing's global business across multiple disciplines and experience working with airlines and suppliers in Korea and Japan. After a successful 4 years at Boeing, Camilo changed career path and joined Google in a sales role for Google Cloud, supporting the Latin American region. Throughout his Google career, Camilo has held multiple sales roles while also working on business development efforts both in the US and Latin American markets. Camilo's roles at Google have also enabled him to be a volunteer of the Google for Startups program, supporting and working with startup founders. A native of Bogota, Colombia, Camilo moved to the United States when he was 11 years old and currently lives in Redmond, Washington. Bienvenido, Camilo. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It is my absolute pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. I have a lot of questions for you that I know my audience will find extremely just very interesting and uplifting, especially your book, which we'll get into a little bit. I actually got the opportunity to read it over the weekend. And so many things resonated with me. So I'll be bringing a couple of those up. But before we get into your book and everything, can you tell us a little bit about just your background in general? And where you came from and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I'll fill in some of the gaps from that initial bio. But as you mentioned, I moved to the US when I was 11 from Bogota, Colombia. So that was in the early 2000s. And in that era of time, Colombia was still going through a lot of upheaval and challenges, to say the least. So, me and my family were essentially part of that Colombian diaspora that extended from, the late 80s through the 90s and, to the late 2000s. And I moved to a suburb close to where I live now, actually. I moved to Bellevue, Washington, which is across from Seattle, Washington. So Bellevue and Redmond are kind of the two main suburbs across Seattle. But essentially, I've been a Seattle quote unquote native since I moved to the U.S. And that afforded me the opportunity to go to the University of Washington, where I studied marketing and entrepreneurship, which I think in hindsight are probably the two majors that you might not need to go to school for. But I learned that I still got a lot of value from obviously going to university, and it afforded me the opportunity to work at Boeing, as you mentioned, travel a lot, work in a global context, which has been key to my worldview and my experiences. And that experience at Boeing is what catapulted me to being part of Google, where I've been coming up on 6 years in mainly sales roles, working multiple geographies, but the one where I've worked almost well, now I guess it's half of my Google career has been Latin America. And I think that's, we could probably get into that a little bit later, but that's in large part because of my heritage, right? And the connection to my culture. So, I guess the other things I would add to that is because not everything is work, right? It's also important for folks to know that, success is, in my opinion, balance. So, I make sure I stay active. I read, I write. Obviously, I wrote a book, so I write quite a bit. But, I also make sure that I spend time with family and friends as well. So I don't want that to get lost in the quote unquote achievements.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's so important. I think sometimes the societal norms don't place a lot of value in that, and it's more about just hustling and just working your tail off, right? Sacrificing everything in between. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we'll definitely be getting into that. I wanted to ask you, just going back a little to when you first came here, do you recall, was it a very sudden thing that your family had to do from the decision point of, hey, we got to go to the US, or was there like time to plan? How was that for you, the way you remember it?
We were fortunate that we're in a position where we had some latitude, right? It's not like, there are factors that's definitely accelerated our move, but it wasn't like you got to move tomorrow or else type of thing. But obviously it hit a point where like this is not sustainable for our well-being or security, everything. It was just not ideal, but it was in like imminent danger. And we fortunately had the resources where we could kind of navigate a little bit. Where we moved to Seattle for a reason, right? And so that means there's some certain degree of thought. But I at that point I was 10. So there's an initial part of the planning that I didn't see, but it didn't feel that sudden to me, but it also didn't seem like predestined. It was not something like, oh, this is going to happen at this point. It just kind of started gaining momentum, and then it happened, and then we traveled here.
Got it. Is there a Colombian community in Seattle? Like when you mentioned like some of the reasons that you chose to go there, was that one of them?
To be frank, I think part of what made the appeal of Seattle, we had family friends who were able to give us a good context as to, it's peaceful here. There's a lot of opportunities. Weather's a little bit difficult, but nice summers. I think they undersold the weather is difficult part, right?
Right.
But you managed. We adapted. But I do think at that point we were looking for a place where, frankly, there weren't that many established Latinos. And I think that's just because of what had been happening in Colombia, we almost kind of, I wouldn't say a clean break, but we wanted definitely a change of scenery. And I do think in part, when you're in a geography or territory where, like a New York or a Miami, it's great because, there a lot of your compatriots are there, but I do think it gets harder to learn the language. And we've always known from the beginning that, like, to be successful, if we're going to make a life change, we needed to know the primary language of the United States, which still is English, right? So I think those were some of the motivating factors why we chose Seattle.
That's pretty bold. I love it, though. That's pretty bold. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because I moved here when I was 11 years old as well from the Dominican Republic. And you're absolutely right. I moved to Washington Heights in Uptown Manhattan, New York City. And you could have easily navigated throughout the neighborhood without knowing English at all. Because there are a lot of people from the Dominican Republic. And it's certainly, I saw some people fall into that trap where they got comfortable there and they never really excelled even in just the language itself, because they were able to watch Spanish television and hang out with Spanish speaking people, and there was like no pressing need to learn English.
Yeah, and there are trade-offs, right? Like, sure, maybe like in Seattle we were able to learn the language faster, but then maybe didn't have that ambience of community that you get in Washington Heights. So you just have to be mindful of the trade-offs as best as you can ahead of time.
No, absolutely. And I'm sure you missed the food too. I don't know how many Colombian restaurants there are there, but...
Not enough. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to disparage the few brave souls in the Seattle area that have made or started Colombia restaurants. There are a few. The ironic thing is that my diet now is mainly vegetarian, which like shuts off like 90% of Colombian cuisine, and like my mom makes arepas all the time. So like I think like the primary quote unquote dish that I love, which is like arepas, it's pretty well covered. Or I can make them myself too if I'm ever wanting to.
Yeah, I used to go to a Colombian place in Jackson Heights, Queens, and food was amazing. The food was amazing.
Yeah,
so
I bet.
one of the benefits too of living in New York City, there's so many little like enclaves. They got Colombian, Cuban, and oh yeah. So tell me a little bit more about assimilating. Then, how hard was it for you to like learn the language, make new friends, new school, all that stuff all at once?
I don't think it was that difficult. And I think part of that is because I've always had an affinity for languages. So I think that's part of it. And the other big part is when I started, when I went, started in private school, not private, public school, and started in ESL classes. There were a few Latino kids, but the majority were, kids from Africa or Eastern Europe, Asia. So to make friends, I had to learn English, right? To bond with them. And I think that motivated me to learn the language quicker. So I actually got out of ESL classes relatively quick. I think it only took me like half a year. And
wow,
then
you're
I started
good.
going to the normal classes. Yeah. And and my family did a good job in making sure that like, not only was I applying myself in school and learning, doing the ESL homework and all that, but watching TV. Like I joke with my friends that like my best English teacher in those early days was watching Friends, on TV with closed captioning. I learned a lot watching Friends, and a lot of other TV, and that's the main thing to do at that time for me. Because I was still kind of getting our bearings. Family was working, so it's kind of like do homework and watch TV, and that accelerated it. And the most, for the other aspects of assimilation, like culture, right? Because language is just one element. I think I did fine. I think once I, was 14, 15 and in high school, I do remember there was kind of like a moment where I became so fearful of losing, one, my Spanish language, but two, like my Colombian roots, that I made deliberate efforts to, continue consuming Colombian culture. So like being very in tune with the news, with the socioeconomic situation, watching Colombian TV. At this time was like YouTube was taking off and all that stuff. Listening to Colombian music. Like obviously at home we spoke Spanish and making sure that. And I even took Spanish class in high school, which people gave me grief about, but I did think like that helped me stave off something that I see in a lot of folks. And I'm not imparting a value judgment, but I can see when sometimes assimilation goes too far into you assimilate, and you might lose part of your I wouldn't say first culture, but your starter culture, I guess. And I was very mindful and intentional in making sure that didn't happen. So that's kind of how my assimilation to the US happened. And then, once you're in college, you're still trying to figure out who you are, right? As most college students. But at that point, I became a lot more comfortable with knowing I'm Colombian and eventually I'm going to be American, right? At that point, I wasn't a citizen yet, but like I felt that my life was going to be being both, and that's okay.
Yeah. And, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying about assimilation going too far. Sometimes you have people that are hard-headed in the sense of like, they're really firm, like, no, I don't want to lose any of it. And then they stay still like kind of, more towards the old primary culture. And then some people go all the way. And I also find it that the second generation, then some of it starts to lose some of it. Because like you stayed in tune, but then, let's say you end up having kids and stuff, and they weren't born in Colombia. They never listened to cumbia, right? It's a hard balance. to
It
try and
is. It
maintain.
is, and it's very personal, right? Because the balance is relative to your upbringing and what you think your identity is.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell me about a bit how then, like, just your Hispanic Latin culture influenced and helped shape some of your career path.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's far influenced it more in the latter half, especially during my Google time. I have the bias and where what I think, quote unquote, the superpowers that being Latino has afforded me and helped me in my career is, obviously that tenacity and that adaptability. I think a lot of immigrants have that tenacity and adaptability because you have to. That like you you learn that whether you like it or not. But I do think that Latinos in particular, because of the situation of our countries or the history of our culture, especially the colonial era, you have to have tenacity, you have to have grit, you have to adapt. It's a bit of that survival mindset, and a lot of that was passed down on me, and that translates into strong work ethic. Um, you know, Also my family upbringing, which I think is also related to Latino culture, was to make sure that 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 I was doing whatever I was doing, that I was at least aiming to be the best at it, and that as I progressed in my life and my career, that I was being respectful and compassionate with others. And I do think that kind of those quote unquote family values, I do think a lot of that is derived from the fact that, at least in my view, one of the key things in Latino culture is that the fundamental unit is the family, which is a bit different than in the U.S., where I would argue that the fundamental unit is the individual, right? So that's I think that's kind of how it gave me a lot of the intangibles. But during my Google time, my Latino heritage was fundamental in one, landing the job at Google, because there were, it was a sales role selling into Latin America, and they needed a Spanish speaker, and I was like, well, I speak Spanish. I never sold, and at that point, I mean, Google Cloud wasn't Google Cloud, right? It was just like work Gmail. That's how people thought about it, and I didn't know much about it, but I was so enamored with the mission of using productivity tools and cloud-based tools to help improve the social and economic well-being of Latin America, that helped me really make sure that like I was focused in getting the job, and then while I was in the job, make sure I was performing, because it felt like it was a little bit bigger than just like getting a paycheck and quote unquote making some sales. It was just like, no, this is my little way to start giving back and start changing both the mindsets, but how people use technology in Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key thing to just continue to develop. Absolutely. I love how you called, your grit and adaptability superpowers. I really love that. Absolutely. And you mentioned a lot the family nucleus, right? And when I was reading your book, it was very clear to me that your mom and your brother seem to have been very influential in your life. So can you tell me a little bit about like who you consider to have been very influential in your life, and just a little bit about them?
I mean, yeah, that felt like a tee up, which I love, because yeah, the answer is it was definitely my mom and my brother, and their influence is both from the values they imparted in me, but also the values they've exhibited, right? So again, like treating people with respect, being compassionate, working really hard, making sacrifices for to support the family, and having a long-term vision and long-term planning, and basically thinking 5 moves ahead. Um, in the context of my brother, um, I joke that he's the CFO of the family, because he's always had that natural passion for finances and investments, and he would argue that he had to um, coerce me into caring about that. But that's, especially as the older I get, having that sort of financial literacy, it's like such a huge component of long-term success. And I feel like if we're talking about like the questioning influential people, and when I talk about my brother, and there are many ways he influenced me, but just to kind of like just hone in on that financial literacy piece, that's one of the areas where like that focus is giving me outsized returns and has helped me make the most out of my career. More than just like the impact, the sense of purpose, and like the good feelings of feeling good at work, but also like, okay, yeah, I'm also being very intentional about how I grow my wealth and approach things from a mindset of abundance. And a lot of these concepts that I'm just throwing out there, I'm still working my way through them, but I would say even exploring them in the first place has been a huge part, by my brother's influence. And that's just a small focused example of their influence. But people that know me well know the outsized impact of my family in my life. I talk to people, they're my rock. And I think out of all the quote unquote superpowers that I have, that's like my secret weapon, right? When, if people were to say, oh, what's your secret, Camilo? I'm like, just had a really good family. And not everybody gets that, right? So I'm fully cognizant that it's like not a guaranteed and a privilege that I have, that I get to enjoy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think having that core support can just shape you in ways that will impact you going forward. Which I think is a great segue for your book, because you mentioned a lot of things like mindset and purpose. So tell us a little bit. I read The Compass, a guide against conventional wisdom and toward a rich life. Tell us a little about the book, why you wrote it, who is it for, and where can we get it?
Funnily enough, the idea for the book started almost a year ago. I decided to, and this was like the week of the election. So I was like, it was going to be a tense week anyways. And I was like super nervous. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to like go off the grid, quote unquote. And what that meant was, I rented like an Airbnb in one of the islands across from Seattle called Whidbey Island. A beautiful place if people ever visit Seattle. And I kind of took that as like, like a creative retreat of sorts, right? So like I was painting, I was reading, and I was writing, I was journaling, because that's one of the habits which I talk about in the book, but that I've implemented for a few years now. And on my way on my drive there, I listened to a podcast by Tim Ferriss, who is a thinker that has definitely also influenced my life, both his books and his podcast. And he had Seth Godin, who I definitely recommend people look him up. He's written tons of books. He's been a very successful marketer, but just author. He writes incredibly well. And in the interview that I listened, he basically said, a lot of people ask themselves, what would you do if you knew you wouldn't fail? And he suggested flipping that on its head and say, what would you do if you knew you were going to fail? So if failure was guaranteed, what would you do? And for some reason, like that question just stayed in my brain during that week. And the conclusion I came to is like, well, I will write a book, because it's kind of one of those things that has been in my bucket list. But then I realized that what was in my bucket list was not the idea of being like a Nobel Prize winning author that would go on book tours and hang out with Oprah. Like, I didn't care about any of that. What I care about is creating something that would impact somebody else positively. So when I abstracted it down to like, that is of the whole quote unquote idealized experience, that's what I really want. And adding that question to analyze that, I was like, yeah, I'm going to write a book. Why? Because if it sucks, like nobody dies. Great. That's a good starting point. And again, if it sucks and I bomb, like no harm, no foul. If anything, it will allow me to think more clearly about my life. right? So once I was able to frame it as an experiment of sorts, it became more clear, like, okay, so I should do this. So then I had kind of like the motivation, like, I'm going to do that. And then I had to figure out, like, okay, what can I speak creatively about? Um, and I arrived at writing the book that I wish I had when I was in college. Because especially with how universities today teach young people how to quote unquote succeed, I think that the world has changed so quickly in the last 20 years that some of those concepts don't hold true. And that's kind of why the subtitle of the book is like a guide against conventional wisdom, because I reflected upon a lot of the unconventional wisdom that I've heard during my college and my early Boeing years, that in hindsight, I'm like, that's not quite right. Like there is a kernel of truth, which is why they uphold themselves as true. But when you really go into the nuance, you're like, one of them is like, work hard and the work will speak for itself, right? Like I grew up believing that. And I actually think that that is a big problem in the Latino community. We when we talk about like work and like work ethic, is like work hard, because that's how you get the benefit. And that's not fully true. Obviously, if you don't work hard, you probably won't get any rewards. But the nuance in that idiom or that conventional wisdom is that you need to learn how to be impactful with how you advocate your work. And you need to basically pick your battles and not throw your effort and energy at just everything because you have work ethic, but because you're prioritizing and you're trying to figure out, where do my efforts give me the most outsized returns? So that's something that, like, in college, they didn't tell you. At your work, they're not going to tell you that. They're not going to tell you, like, in general, they're going to want you to work hard. Why? Because who reaps the benefit of that work? The employer, for most of it, right? Um, so that's kind of part of when I wrote that book, is I wanted to make sure that younger folks who are going into their first job, and I've also had feedback from friends who are doing a career pivot, and that book has also been a good, like, trampoline. Uh, so either folks in a crossroads, folks in just starting their career, that they wouldn't have to, like, endure a lot of the pains that comes with maybe blindly following that conventional wisdom. So I wrote the book for them. It also helped me, to be honest, in that process, clarifying a lot of my thoughts. And right now, the book is hosted in a platform called Gumroad, which I definitely encourage people to check out. But you can just go to thecompassebook.com. And that way you can get it really quick. It's a PDF, or you can download it into your Kindle. Sooner rather than later, it's probably also going to be in the Amazon Kindle store, because that's where all ebooks live. But yeah, that's a little bit about the book, why I wrote it, and how people can get it.
Okay, great. Yeah, and for those listening, I'll be putting a direct link to where you can get the book in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. I promise I will not be giving your whole book away in terms of the content, right? But I wanted to touch on some of the stuff you mentioned, like working hard, because sometimes that can lead to burnout, right? And a lot of the times we may be working hard towards something that's not really going to be a useful outcome for you. And I have a degree in economics, so I was very familiar when you were talking about diminishing returns. But I like how you called it a colorless rainbow, right? Where it's kind of like you get to a point where an increased measure of output is not going to give you any more return on that, right? So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you, as an individual that is aware of this now, how do you know when to quit, in a sense? Like, at which point do you say, okay, you know what, maybe it's time for me to, like, pivot?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't want my answer to imply that I've mastered it, because I think, for starters, you can never really master it. That's what makes it so hard. But so important to at least try to figure out. I think where I try to start off is with the acceptance that I might make the wrong decision, because I may not have all the information. that I need at that point to make the decision. And I typically ask myself, especially when you get to that point, like, should I just stay what I'm doing, or should I quit? I try to figure out, and this is something that I've been working in even in this past year, but I try to see, is this really a binary? Is this an either stay or quit, or is there a middle path? And if I have three options instead of two, how does that make me feel, right? Like, your body tells you a lot if you pay attention to it. So I kind of start with trying to figure out, is there a gray area in this binary that my brain is setting up? And then what I typically do is I try to think about it like good old pros and cons. Like, I've used a legit paper and pen, pros on one side, cons on the other. And then I kind of just throw things out on paper, because I know that that's kind of how I do my thinking. Some people are more like, they have to speak to think, right? That's how they process. I need to write to think. So I try to get it out on paper, externalize it from my brain, and then kind of, once it's on paper, start prioritizing. Um, and also trying to figure out, while I'm looking at the list, thinking in terms of probabilities, right? Like, let's say I'm gonna quit my job, for instance, because I made a pros and cons list of why I should stay versus why I should go, and maybe the pros won because the things that I prioritized the most were the ones I was not getting in my job. And then I try to think in terms of probability. So if I'm quitting a job, probably I would like to have another job or like have another career. And then the next question is, what are the things I need to do to increase my odds of success? So it's not binary. It's not like I'm going to quit my job and then I'm going to 100% get another job. I don't think about it like that, because a lot of things could go wrong, right? Like, a lot of things are expected. Like, imagine if you quit your job February 2020 because you wanted to start a restaurant.
Yeah.
And maybe you did the business case, maybe you had like an incredible concept. And at that point, your probability of maybe being successful was like 80%. And then COVID happened. And then your probability of success became probably like 1%. Right? So like, there are things you just can't plan. But the idea, the mindset behind it is, how do you think about decisions in terms of probabilities? And how do you increase the information you have to make those decisions, to increase your chances of success, but also give yourself options, and make sure that you have very clear criteria. So let's say I wanted to change jobs and it was another career. I would have to know what I needed to do. And then I would have to also give myself certain deadlines, especially if maybe I didn't have the financial resources, right? Because yeah, obviously if you have like financial runway, you can do a lot of these things. So you also have to understand what are your constraints, and be very honest about your constraints, because the last thing you want to do is surprise yourself, especially when you have the information. So I guess to summarize it as, I try to practice, and this is really hard for me, but I try to practice acceptance that I might just be wrong in my decision, or whether I keep going with something or where I quit. I try to list out my assumptions, the pros and cons, and then I try to figure out what additional information do I need to increase the probability of the decision that I want to make. That increase the probability that the decision I want to make is going to be the best outcome for me.
Got it. So again, it comes to like a juggling act to some degree, right? Because you're separating the decision from the outcome as well. It's kind of like accepting this may not be interesting.
Yeah. And that's super hard to do, because I honestly, that's something I learned very recently. And there's a great book that, I had kind of already started nibbling on that idea, but the book that just kind of like slapped me in the face and said like, yeah, you need to adopt this. It's called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. She's, I think, she's a college professor, but she's a professional poker player. So she uses her experience as a professional poker player to talk about that you really need to separate the decision from the outcome. Otherwise, everything in hindsight looks amazing, right? But because you knew what the information you needed was to make the best decision. But that, the world doesn't function on hindsight like that. So
That's very true. So let me ask you this: how important are habits when it comes to this process?
By what? By this process? What?
Like once you decide, like you say, you know what, I'm quitting my job and I'm opening a restaurant, right? There's got to be a certain amount of things you're gonna do between now and then, right? Between the hopeful outcome that you have. I know you mentioned some stuff in the book about habits, and then you combine them with like the mindset and how they act as like kind of like a rocket booster. So can you expand a little bit on that for us?
Yeah, I think habits is kind of it's really what helps you execute, because motivation is fleeting. Um, and I think it also depends on the person, but there's some people that love starting things, projects, businesses, ideas. There's some people that hate the start but love to wrap them up, like the closers, quote unquote. But the habit, for both of those types of characters, habits is what helps you execute. It's kind of like the lowest common denominator you default to making sure that you're executing. And I don't mean just habits in the professional context, or like even in this example. I think habits are grounding. When life is unpredictable, when it throws random things at you, again, like COVID, habits are a way to give predictability to our lives. And humans like comfort. That's why we have comfort zones. But I think, paradoxically, habits are what allow you to get out of your comfort zones, because you already have a foundation. So then now that you have a quote unquote home base of your habits, of like your exercise, how well you sleep, your alcohol consumption, your journaling practice, meditation, or whatever. Once you already know that you have certain rhythm in your life, then you can take more risks, because you know that if that risk fails or whatever you do fails, you still got your habits to back into. And typically, a lot of the habits that I talk in the book, like sleep, like eating, eating well, like my exercise, they're just gonna make you a happier human. Period. Like this is this is demonstrated, like the benefits of exercise, the benefits of mindfulness, the benefits of sleep, which is something that people don't talk enough. They will just make you a happier person. So if anything, what is the importance of habits is like they will increase your likelihood of being happy regardless of your circumstance, period.
Right. And it's interesting because it sounds to me under that context that habits are actually freeing to some degree, because you have like, some people might look at it like this structure, and like the word discipline might be have a negative connotation to it. But it sounds like, to me, the way I look at it is, once you have all these things that you do every day, because you're so right, motivation, it's not going to always be there, so you have to rely on habits, because there's plenty of times you're not going to feel like getting up early or going to the gym and all of that stuff. And yeah, you're so right about that. One of the things that I started doing a while back, and I still feel like I do some variations of it, but is the concept of journaling. And I know that you do a lot of it. And I love how you break it down into like 3 different sections, of the parts of the journaling that you do. So one of them obviously is just like literally just writing down, but it was cool to me, like the list of questions that you had. And you mentioned one of them, which I'm glad it wasn't a typo. It actually made me think and read it again, because you said, what would you do if you knew you would fail? And I was like, did he mean wouldn't fail?
Yeah.
But when you explained it at the beginning, it just made complete and total sense. So like, if you knew what the outcome was and it wasn't favorable, would you still do it anyway? And if so, then that's what you really need to be doing, right? There's a lot of power in that. So thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. You also talk about the concept of gratitude as well as part of your journaling practice. So tell us about the idea behind that.
Yeah. And that is part of my daily journal routine. There's been a multitude of touch point or nudges that I in podcasts, conversations with people that I look up to, books I've read, where the idea of gratitude was pretty prevalent as a way to not let yourself get caught up in the day to day, but also, I mean, count your blessings, right? Even in the context of religion, it's there, it's everywhere. But what that reflection on gratitude does for me is that it helps me see the bigger picture, and also it kind of helps me do a little bit of like a trend analysis of, because in the journal prompt that I use, I typically think about three things that I'm grateful for, and obviously, like, I don't put it every day because sometimes I'm like, okay, I got to switch it up and find additional things to be grateful for. But one of the often things I'm grateful for is my family. So then that keeps me in that, like, oh, if I'm grateful for my family pretty often, I got to make sure I'm investing my time appropriately to making sure that they feel my gratitude. Right. So it's it's both as a way to ground yourself, especially when you have a really bad day. Like, a gratitude practice will always make you feel better. Like, I recommend, like, the next time, one of your listeners is just having a terrible day, and we all have them, just like take like deep breaths, and like think of like at least one thing you're grateful for. And if you can't think of anything, then you should be grateful that you're alive and that you're experiencing the full range of the human experience, good and bad. Um, and even just going back to that is kind of like, okay, there's more to me than what I'm experiencing right now. And it also creates distance from those feelings, especially when they're negative, because then you know that you're not angry, you're just experiencing anger or frustration, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the gratitude practice helps you kind of create that space so that you can kind of step back and be like, oh, okay, I'm just feeling this, I'm not this. But also, if you do it consistently, it also helps you figure out what you really value in life, because that's what you're probably going to write the most that you're grateful for in answering that prompt.
I love that. Separating, because then it's kind of like you're not letting the feeling define you. Because if you let it define you, you take on that identity, right? I'm angry.
That can be a very dark cycle. When you embody your feelings, especially negative ones, that's where you can feel stuck and in a rut. And you're like, well, how can I not feel angry if I am angry, right? When you give that your feelings that much power, good luck. Like,
yeah,
trying
you
to
have to
change that
act in
narrative.
accordance of an angry person, then, right?
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So I have a few more questions for you before we wrap up, but I wanted to just ask you again, where can we get the book? And also, if you are on social media, is there any particular handle you like to share, any website, things like that?
Yeah. So again, the book is thecompassebook.com. And then nowadays I'm more active on Twitter. So my handle is at Camilo More-Sala. People can find me there. Also on LinkedIn, just look up my name, Camilo Moreno-Salamanca. Yeah, people can reach out in those mediums.
Got it. And I'll be sure to put those links in the show notes as well, so people can just click on them and directly go to them. So yeah, thank you so much so far. This has been amazing. I really like everything you've shared. And yeah, I had a great time reading the book, and now I get to meet you and speak with you about it, which is amazing. So thank you so much for sharing all of that stuff. Some of the parting questions I had for you, one of them is, let's say that you were in an elevator with someone, and you both got in on the ground floor, you're going up to the 12th floor, you're going to be together for like 45 seconds. You're never going to see them again. So what is your best piece of advice that you would give that person, knowing that you're not going to see them again? Which kind of like I take it into, what is like your best advice for all Hispanic and men and women out there trying to go after the dream?
I'll tell you the advice, but I'll also share an anecdote, because the imagery just it reminded me when I was at Boeing. I think this was like my second year in. I'm an early bird. So I got into the office like at 7 a.m. And then I get in the elevator, and in business school they're like, you gotta have an elevator pitch, blah blah blah, and like at that point I already knew what elevator pitch is. I think I had one, probably a crappy one. I get in the elevator 7 a.m. It's like Tuesday morning, and then I look, and it's like the CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes, who's kind of like the second in command at Boeing. And, the building was not that big. It's like 4 stories, but, the door closes and I'm like, it's elevator pitch time. And I just kept telling myself, it's elevator pitch time. And like, just froze. And, obviously I think he probably sensed my nervousness because, he knows he's the CEO. So, so he says, hi, I'm Ray. Ray Connor. And I was like, hi, I'm Camilo. Nice to meet you. I know he said, nice to meet you. And I said, yeah, I seen you before. that was like my response. Yeah, I've seen you before. Which is kind of like a weird thing to say to somebody, obviously he's the CEO. So it's kind of like, of course you've seen me before. I'm the CEO. And before I could take the foot out of my mouth and say something eloquent or insightful or give even more context as to who I was, we've arrived into the floor that we were in. So when our merry-go ways. So that is to say, I'm going to give 2 pieces of advice. The first one is definitely have an elevator pitch. Don't be Camilo in that elevator, but don't necessarily make your pitch like so like business. Like think about it in the context of like who you are. Like, and the elevator pitch will change as you change, right? Like my elevator pitch is different. And it's actually something I've been thinking about in the last couple of weeks. I'm like, how do I define myself more like concisely? It's a good exercise for people to do and keep doing. So I guess going back to your question, if I met a stranger in the elevator, I will be very meta and say, have an elevator pitch. But that is very genuine. Doesn't have to be professional. It has to be true to you first and foremost. And the second piece of advice I would give them is the answers that you're looking for are within. We all have the answers and the wisdom that we require to navigate our lives. And part of what I'm really passionate about is making sure people understand that we have that self-aware, that if we develop that self-awareness, we tune in inward, we're going to have that ability to navigate life and the challenges and embrace the good and the bad. And it's funny because, I read a lot of quote unquote self-help books. I wrote this book, which is supposed to, I called it The Compass, which is kind of bold, right? To say like, oh, I will help you navigate your life. And it's ironic that my piece of advice is you actually don't need my book. What you actually need first and foremost is to be in tune with yourselves, with your values, your purpose. And it's not something you figure out once and you're done for, because humans evolve and life changes. So it's kind of like that constant practice of self-awareness and inquiring and really getting into like the dark, not so cool stuff that we have within, but knowing how to manage that and actually access it is actually where we can find a lot of the elements that will help us live more intentionally. And I don't say necessarily happily. I just think we just need to live more intentionally. And I think that will naturally derive satisfaction and happiness.
Yeah, and fulfillment. That makes a lot of sense. Well said, my friend. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Again, be sure to check out The Compass, A Guide Against Conventional Wisdom and Towards a Rich Life. I will put the link in the show notes. Thank you, Camilo, so much for taking the time to being here with us. I look forward to having future conversations with you. I'm sure at some point there might be like a second book or a sequel to it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Felice. This was a really fun conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Me too, likewise as well. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Stay tuned for Hispanic Heritage Month, Growing Up Latino. Growing Up Latina, we have some great guests, as you've seen, guests like Camilo, who have a lot of great information to share with you. So thank you for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to On My Way to Wealth. If you have any questions, please send me an email at luis@onmywaytowealth.com. The information provided here is for information and education purposes only. The opinions expressed herein are solely those of myself, unless otherwise specifically cited. Material presented is believed to be from reliable sources, and no representations are made by my firm or myself about other parties' information or accuracy or completeness. All information or ideas provided should be discussed in detail with a financial advisor, accountant, or legal counsel prior to implementation. Thank you.